And then I'm going to be nice to everyone because now that we're recording it, I can't make all my snarky comments that I like to. But Gareth, I'm really glad you were willing to do this. I'm a bit excited. And then in between the time we first talked about it and now, you guys have done like 10 new amazing things. So maybe it's better that we waited a little while to do this. But the floor is all yours, sir.
Oh, well, thank you, David. And as we say in New Zealand, in Te Reo Māori, kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. I just said greetings to all of you in our first language in New Zealand. It's a real privilege to be able to connect. I passionately believe the poly crisis that we face, we can't solve it in a single community, in a single town, in a single country. We need to work hyper locally, but we also need to be collaborating internationally. So it's a great privilege to be able to connect with you all, and thanks for organizing this, David. Being part of a global organization, I find really inspiring and hopeful, and I'm looking forward to having more opportunities for us to connect globally. I want to share my screen. I've got a short presentation I'd love to share with you, introduce myself, talk about some of the activities and the reasons for hope I have here in New Zealand, and then we've got heaps of time for questions. So hopefully my accent isn't too strong and you are able to understand me. Um, I always start with this slide with every presentation I give because I think one of the most important challenges we face is how do we measure progress and how do we move past GDP and economic growth as the proxy for social progress. Catherine Trebeck, the global co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, suggests in some countries, it's children riding their bikes to school could be a much better measure of progress. It tells you about gender relations, it tells you about infrastructure, educational investment, safety. So that's why I love to have that image there. To introduce myself, I come to this work growing up in a small provincial town called Gisborne in the North Island's East Coast. In New Zealand, our Reagan Revolution we call Rogernomics. And I still remember in the early 80s, sorry, the late 80s, my father losing his job with 900 other men at the freezing works, the biggest employer in my town. And then I remember my mother, 2 years later, under a separate government, having her benefits slashed as a solo mother. As part of our last economic revolution. Ever since then, I've gone on to try and make a better world because I saw the impact and the trauma on my community. I feel like I've tried all the different tactics available. I've tried leading campaigns with Greenpeace and giant marches, legal cases, governance, hands-on work. I've tried non-violent direct action. That is me, once upon a time, getting arrested dressed as Ronald McDonald for a successful protest. And then I got myself elected, where I served in the New Zealand Parliament for more than a decade with the Green Party, where I passed laws and amendments, negotiated with prime ministers and ministers. Um, we're able to get some big wins, like banning all offshore oil exploration in New Zealand. But it wasn't until I retired from politics and I moved to a tiny conservation island. This is the island I spent the COVID years. It's called Quarantine Island, if you can believe it. And I had this island to myself with my family. And it was there thinking after 20 years of activism and political change that I reflected I'd spent so much of my time at the bottom of the cliff, focused on improving the type of ambulance that was at the bottom of the cliff. We needed to think deeply, systemically, and really embrace the economic drivers of poverty, of inequality, of the climate crisis, etc. So I'm the director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa New Zealand. Aotearoa is the traditional name for New Zealand. I describe our work as a think tank and a do tank. We do research, we do policy, but we're also actively connecting people, pushing for some big transformational ideas. A challenge for me coming from New Zealand is most people think about Lord of the Rings or beautiful snow-covered mountains, and people think we might be clean and green and doing well. But actually, we're a deeply unsustainable country, a deeply unjust and unequal society, and one where the same pressures my friends in the States report that the lack of social trust, social cohesion, We recently had a national poll that came out. We had one of the highest levels of support for authoritarian solutions to the economic problems facing our country than almost any other developed country. So we've got very real challenges. In New Zealand, we have 5 areas of focus. The first is providing an alternative to our current broken economy. We're working on what we call a blueprint for prosperity, an action plan, taking the lessons from the last economic revolution, our Reagan revolution in the 1980s, where people had worked behind the scenes on a coherent policy platform for systemic change. We're currently working with experts and the public to develop that. We also have organised our work around the 4 areas where we're most optimistic for the future. The first is our indigenous leadership in New Zealand. When we talk about a wellbeing economy in New Zealand, we don't present this as a new idea. In fact, this is a deeply ancient concept that's been in New Zealand for centuries before colonialism. Secondly, we focus on local communities and their ability to drive change, be it in towns and cities or community wealth building. Thinking long term and with future generations is our third area of hope, led by young people. And lastly, the role of business and finance to get on and make the positive change. And I'm currently with a couple of hundred amazing people talking about nature and business in Auckland today. Today, I'm just going to talk about 4 very quick things to share some of the insights and ideas coming out of New Zealand. The first is our world first wellbeing budgets. Secondly, the leadership we see coming from indigenous approaches. Our local government report we've just published, and also some of our campaigns we have going forward. So the first is the wellbeing budgets, which came about under the previous Jacinda Ardern government. I was privileged to serve with Jacinda as part of that government. And for the first time, our government asked itself, as you can see in the quote on the slide, how could we measure progress as a country differently? How could we move past just gross domestic product as a success and assuming that that will trickle down, or we can use some of the tax and budgets to spend on the impacts that in many cases were caused by chasing that economic growth. The wellbeing budgets were world first. They used a whole different methodology, which I could talk about if anyone's interested, how to develop better, more joined up policy interventions by the government. However, working for an international organization, they were often presented as silver bullets and solving a huge amount of problems at one go. One of the challenges is that they weren't transformational. It ignored nature and the environment in much of its work. The wellbeing budgets approach has been totally scrapped by the latest Conservative government in New Zealand. So they didn't have longevity. We would love to talk more about some of the highlights, some of the opportunities, the wins, but also some of the downsides. The wellbeing budgets were built by our Treasury Department, who used the image on the left, which is New Zealand's Living Standards Framework. Instead of measuring one indicator, GDP, which we measure quarterly in New Zealand, I think you measure monthly in the States, we developed a much more comprehensive framework for measuring progress that looked at our individual measures, how we're doing from our health to our housing, through to our collective institutions, through to what you might call, getting a bit of feedback. There we go. Through to our collective assets, which are more than just monetary financial assets, such as our natural environment. Interestingly, the Living Standards Framework, which was the underpinnings for the wellbeing budgets, was then adapted further through an Indigenous, Māori, and Pacific Islands perspective, with the circle image on the right, which is called Aotearoa, which is being embraced by our government departments. I think it's interesting that they've turned from quite a boxy, linear framework to a more circular, holistic framework. Wairua, the word in the centre, is effectively the spirit, a challenge to sort of Western approaches who don't consider the spiritual dimensions or the connections between all of us. In fact, the word Wairua literally translates as two waters. And what that means in traditional Māori approaches is the waters that connect the universe through Māori cosmology or ways of knowing knowledge, mataranga, through to the literal water in our body, which we're connected to all living animals. Next to that is the natural world. So instead of the natural world just being an asset that we can measure, is it in positive or negative, this reflects the deeply intrinsic connection between us, the economy, and nature. Moving on to Indigenous perspectives as my second topic, this is a wonderful reimagining of Kate Raworth's iconic donut economic framework, a reimagined through an Indigenous lens by Taina Boasadeen. What's interesting about the Māori donut, or te takarangi, is that it's been inverted. Instead of the environment or planetary boundaries being an external separate thing to us that we must not breach, it's been inverted. In fact, our relationship with nature and the environment is the heart of all of our prosperity, the heart of all of our relationships. So that's actually become the foundation, the floor, rather than an external barrier. In New Zealand, we're really proud of some of our pioneering approaches, from some of the first welfare state initiatives in the 30s through to one of our most famous economists, Marilyn Waring, who brought in the first critiques of GDP, not counting the role of women in society, and then later on the role of the environment in economic measures. And I think we're doing something similar again with sharing Indigenous approaches with the world. 2 weeks ago, we published a new report called Amplifying Māori Economies, and we've worked with some leading researchers in New Zealand, and I can share the link after this for what a Māori-led economy would look like. And as someone who's not Indigenous to New Zealand myself, I find this an absolutely hopeful way that we could escape this colonial neoliberal status quo to one that thinks long term, that one is deeply connected, where instead of our national rich list, where we count the wealth of billionaires and who's gone up and down the list, we might actually think differently about what success means as a business leader, and maybe actually lifting up your employees, regenerating nature, not just doing less bad stuff, would be more modern measures of success, or mana, an incredibly powerful word we use in New Zealand. In New Zealand, we've got lots of examples of where the Māori economy is changing the country in practice through to reciprocity, that's the economies of mana, the economies of care or aroha or love. We've given legal personhood to natural features such as the Wanganui River listed, where this is an entity established in law. I was very proud to vote for this in person, that this entity now has a council who can act on its behalf, can invoke legal applications to protect itself, through to new ways of considering what a circular economy might be using an interesting framework called indigenous circulonomics. The third area I want to talk about, which is our local towns and cities and the leadership they can lead. And I want to acknowledge, I know there's great stuff that WEAll California has been doing, working with local municipalities, and I've been really inspired by the work you've been doing there. It's our elections this year for our towns, cities, and regions. We've just published a policy guide where we wanted to share independent policy advice to the thousands of candidates running this election. In the end, we had 100 policies with 85 case studies showing how these ideas or policies or examples were working in practice. I'll share a quick video that shares some of the highlights.
Policy for the Public Good, a local government resource guide, provides candidates, council staff and citizens with the policies and case studies to build local economies that work for people, place and planet. We share 8 big questions with 100 practical evidence-based policies. We ask questions like, how can we generate and maintain wealth locally? How can our communities be more involved in decision making? We cover areas from waste prevention, reuse and recycling to prioritising fair employment. With input from over 100 people and organisations, we have uncovered a wealth of local success stories. There are 80 case studies highlighting leadership from across Aotearoa and overseas. Practical examples such as Amotai, the Māori and Pacifica Business Directory, or returning taonga and whenua to Hapua Niue, or Kapiti Coast District Council's use of donor economics. There are also spotlights on important kaupapa like community wealth building, land value capture, and the Porirua Assembly on climate. Our section on how to talk about policies for public good shares values-based messaging tips, including the link between rates and the public good. For citizens, we hope this guide supports you to consider good policies that build resilience and well-being across Aotearoa. Please read, share, and discuss this guide. Ngā mihi nunui. Policy for the public good. A local government.
And just the last point I'd like to share is the report we published last year was on community wealth building. In the US, I understand you call it the Cleveland model, after the Evergreen Cooperative and the work that happened in Cleveland. In the UK, they call it the Preston model after that Northern English city. In New Zealand, we're still looking for our example, what our city could be. We looked at the International Community Wealth Framework, a way to build sustainable wealth in local communities, and the 5 pillars. And what we found is that many of our regions are doing 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of the pillars, from using land to assets, encouraging employee ownership. No one was doing all 5 like cities are doing in the States or the UK. So we're on the hunt for our Cleveland in New Zealand, and we're working with councils, some very small ones and some very large ones, about how we could have some demonstration opportunities here. So that's a quick summary into my journey to thinking systemically and economically, some of our priority work in New Zealand. Would love to talk to you about anything else that we're doing or that's happening in New Zealand, or the international connections. But as we say in New Zealand, ngā mihi, which translates as thank you very much. So thanks, David. Thanks, team.
Gareth, that was amazing. I feel so inadequate now, all these things you've done. And just, can we give a shout out to the person who does all your design work and marketing? Because, I mean, she's just amazing. She's really got an eye for how to lay out things and move them around. Is that Georgie or?
Georgie, yes.
Yeah.
Please follow her Instagram. We've got
Yeah.
she's got some great stuff she's posting.
Yeah, she really is doing amazing stuff. So want to open it up to the group. Those who've been here before know that we try and make sure everybody gets one question first, and prefer that you ask it live on camera instead of in the chat, and to keep it as a question as opposed to describing something that's happening in your garden, or a complaint about something I did last week. So who would like to ask the first question? You can raise your physical hand or your virtual hand. Christine, good to see you again.
It's good to see you. I'm thrilled to be here. This was fabulous and really exciting. Is the publication, I believe it was The Public Good, the yellow booklet, is that available online or someplace? It seems that your messaging and the ways that you frame things, we could learn a lot from that. I'm just wondering if there's a way that we could access it.
Yeah, I'll find the link for you and put it in the chat now, Christine. And I think what really drew me to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance globally was the theory of change behind the organization. I feel like I'm a bit of an alien sometimes talking to people, and they ask me what I do for a job, and I say my job is to transform the economic system. And they say, oh, is that a small job that you're working on then? It's big, it's huge, it's audacious, and the theory of change is critical. And for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, I describe it as we need new knowledge. We need the policies, the research, but critically, we need to change the story. We need a new collective narrative. So we did a lot of research right at the beginning. What words and language was most effective for New Zealand? I actually spent 6 weeks driving around the country in a camper van, organising what we called an economics listening tour. I was going to go talk to people about all the great international ideas, from donut to solidarity to circular economics, and I got some good advice. Why don't you flip it on its head, and why don't you just listen to ordinary people and what they think about the environment? So that's really helped with our narratives and our messaging. But let me just quickly pull up the link and I can share the report with you.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for
Thank
all the
you.
links to put them in, but I couldn't find it easily. Who else has a question? Leilani, please.
Hi, thank you, David, and thank you, Gareth. That was really exciting and inspiring. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about the cultural conversation and how you're thinking about the putting the relationship with the earth and the ecosystem at the center of the donut, and if that ties into the rights of nature work that you've been doing. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Leilani. And I think this is such an interesting, exciting topic to be discussing here and around the world. As I mentioned, I'm at a nature and business conference today. We just heard from a leading Māori businessman in New Zealand who's working with some US companies on bioscience using native plants in New Zealand, which are in many cases better than traditional chemical plants for everything from eczema to acne to other issues. And what they've done is actually put nature on the board of these companies. They've created entirely new entities uh, that can benefit from the profits from the companies. So, for example, there's one plant, an entity was established to represent the plant with indigenous voices on that board table. That then has a board seat on the company where the profits are flowing back to benefit that plant and the different tribes located in the regions where it grows. So you can see the idea of local communities being on the boards, but actually natural entities being on the boards of companies or have their own legal entity in the case of mountains and rivers. In New Zealand, I think it's probably fair to say it's contested. We've made a huge amount of progress in recent decades, but our current government is responding to some of that progress and I believe trying to take us backwards. So we have a foundational treaty in New Zealand, which is our proxy constitution that was signed between the British Crown and Māori tribes in 1840. Our government currently is trying to remove that from legislation, is removing Māori representation on our councils and boards, removing the use of the Māori language by government departments. So unfortunately, the progress we have seen and where I see the most inspiring catalysts for change, it's going to be hard to escape our current dominant paradigm. But through this constitutional framework we have with Māori approaches, that's where I see the most likelihood for systemic transformation. But we're seeing a pushback, and that's particularly led by older generations, entrenched interests. I think it's interesting if folks followed the similar moves in Australia under their previous government, where they had a very controversial referendum called The Voice around Aboriginal rights in Australia. I think we are seeing something that is coordinated internationally, that is trying to roll back Indigenous voices and Indigenous power. In New Zealand, Māori and the treaty that I mentioned have been blocks to selling public assets, have been blocks to mining and oil drilling at sea. And I believe this is why they're a target by some powerful vested interests here and connected globally that are trying to roll back that progress. But what we see again is the vitality and these new ideas flowing through. The last thing I'll point out, the lead researcher of our Māori Economies report, Dr. Matthew Scobie, he's got a great quote, which is, "Modern economics is blind to power and history," which I think is so true. And in New Zealand, we should ask, who has the land, why, what was the history of that land, how was it taken, what was it purchased for? And then secondly, in New Zealand, one of the most things that is commodified and taken from us is our time. We work some of the longest hours in the OECD region at the moment. We actually are having our time taken from us, which is also limiting our ability to participate democratically. So in New Zealand, we talk about returning land to the original owners, and a new conversation our report has started is how do we return time back as well?
Like that. Laura, was that Laura Burgess? Was that you raising your hand or applauding? Okay. Okay. Mind blown. Got it. All right. Looks like I might have to start asking all my questions because I don't see anyone else raising their hand. All right. Well, Ethan, please go first.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. Um, I was going to school in California. I was working with David and Laura, kind of looking into some of the barriers to well-being projects in California, actually. Um, I think my question for you is kind of generally, as you're traveling in a camper van and talking to everyday people, like what were some of the attitudes towards these kind of unfamiliar topics of well-being economics? Um, and I kind of wanted to see how they compare to the case in California.
Yeah, great question, Ethan. Maybe three points I'd like to raise. The first thing, and I think maybe the scariest thing, is how uncomfortable and unable people felt to talk about economics, full stop. People feel like they need a degree or to work for a bank to have any sort of mandate to be able to speak publicly about that. I think that's dangerous for a society if people can't talk about such a critical thing. So we did a lot of work trying to break the ice, trying to encourage and empower people to feel able to be able to speak about it. The second thing was in our report, I think maybe the major takeout was a word cloud. When we asked people, and we got representative samples of people in small towns and large ones to join these workshops, is that unanimously, the words people use to describe our current economic system is almost universally negative. It's extractive, it's short term, it's uncaring. But when you ask them what they want to see, it's things like long term, caring, connected to nature, fairer. So we've got a real disconnect between what people want to see and what we actually see in reality. And I think the third takeout for me from that, and this has, I think, been validated by talking to politicians, talking to economists, talking to everyday people on the street, is that they love the idea of a more circular, regenerative, caring economy, a well-being economy, but they just don't see it's possible. They see it as utopian, and frankly, they see it as kind of fuzzy and something that they can't see, they can't grasp. So that's why we've structured our work around the practical things that are already happening, but also this vision of what an economy could be and the policy steps to get there. I think we have to make it much more tangible for people. John Maynard Keynes described the problem isn't the lack of ideas, it's moving past the current ideas that we've got is the big challenge. And I think that's yeah, our challenge is that people feel stuck in the system. They don't see plausible pathways to get off it. On a related note, I saw Kate Raworth recently do a study with the London School of Economics where they found 400 business leaders in the UK. 93% of them were open to degrowth ideas, were sold on donut economics, but they only thought that half of their peers thought like they did. So we see a massive gap between what people individually believe, but what they think their peers also think. So again, that's part of the challenge. We all know that we need to get off this speeding car that's hurtling towards the cliff of the polycrisis, but they're nervous and they don't know if we've got the right directions to get off there.
Great. So, Christine, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a question first, but before I do, I'll let Stephen go.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Gareth. I unfortunately had to miss some of this, so if what I asked you already talked about, just stop me. But I want to preface my question with, I'm a huge fan of WEAll for a long time, and DEAL as well, the Donut Economics Action Lab. But I just got a blog from a developing, I think it's called, let me just look, it's called Developing Economics. It's a critical perspective on development economics. And the blog that I just got, a short one, it's called The Donut and the Divide. and it was a debate between Kate Rayworth and a guy named Max Ajl, AJL. And the question being asked is whether you can do things in a way that doesn't confront capitalism and imperialism. I mean, the conclusion of the blog was the donuts appeal lies in its promise of a painless transition, not painless, but we must remind ourselves and each other of one thing: justice isn't achieved by appealing to the oppressor's spreadsheets. And I wanted your comments. I've talked to WEAll people, and I know a lot of them are anti-capitalist and anti-patriarchal, obviously, and anti-racist. But that blog was a very powerful one, and I wondered how you react to that issue, Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. If you could put the blog in the chat, I would love to read it. I haven't read that myself.
Will do.
I'm very open to that conversation, and it resonates with me. I'm not sure if you caught the beginning of the presentation where we're using indigenous Māori perspectives
I
and
did.
grounding our work as an organization that the staff, we call them Pakeha or of European descent in New Zealand. And that's where we see the future effectively. So we're really very much talking about colonialism, constitutional transformation as a needed step to unlock a fairer, more just future. I struggle with the word capitalism myself. I think it's such a contested word, and people have so many different understandings of what it is. When we look at in early New Zealand's history, our indigenous people were trading with America before the treaty was signed. So we're always going to have a future, I believe, of trading, and I think markets can play a positive role when appropriately regulated. But this hyper-capitalist extractive economy, is leading nowhere fast, that we need to get off it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll put
please
it in
do
the chat.
post the blog chat. So I'm going to ask a question before I turn it over to Carrie, which is you and Jacinda and a group of people were able to get the original Wellbeing Economy budget passed, which seemed like an amazing feat at the time. And you mentioned in your presentation that a lot of it has been dismantled or torn apart. But I'm curious how you got it passed in the first place. And, given the strong headwinds of the different people who are lobbying to dismantle things like that, how did it even get passed, and how might you replicate that success, or how might we replicate that success here in California, etc.?
Yeah, a great question, David. And I wouldn't want to claim credit. This was very much, led by Jacinda and our finance minister, Grant Robertson. I was just there voting for it. I wasn't an architect. I think it was a part of the right place, right time, but critically with the right preparation. So the living standards framework, that graphic that I showed earlier, that actually started work under a previous Conservative government. In the early 2000s. So the underlying architecture had survived changes of governments, had been developed and improved under successive governments. So it didn't come out of a policy vacuum. I think the right time was that in New Zealand, we've got a German style politics. We call it mixed member proportional, which means we have, I don't know, 3 parties as part of our government. I think there are 7 parties in our parliament. So we've become very used to coalition governments where parties come together and negotiate to form a government. We broke the stranglehold of our Democrats and Republicans in the 1990s equivalent. And our populist Conservative Party, called New Zealand First, I think in the wake of the GFC was really staunchly questioning neoliberalism, and they became a coalition partner with us, the Greens, and the Labour Party, our Democrat equivalents, to be part of the government. So you had 3 parties really heavily criticising the neoliberal status quo. which hadn't always been the case, particularly with that conservative populist party. So that was we had the preparation. The time was right. People were questioning the system, especially post the GFC. And after 9 years of a conservative government beforehand, people were pretty sick of the tinkering and the focus on the ineffective ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. I do want to give a caveat. I think they were widely reported internationally, and I think the amount of rhetoric is greater than the actual impact on the ground. Some of the lessons for me is that the wellbeing budgets used a new framework to make budget decisions, but it was only about the 2% of new expenditure the government was doing that year. I understand Canada subsequently has used a similar framework to look at all of their government expenditure. If you're only looking at 2%, you're really looking at the margins rather than a systemic evaluation. The environment was really missing from the quantifiable framework that was used by the Treasury. I think you can't ignore the environment in the 2020s, right? And the fact that it was sold as a Labour Party policy meant that our conservative opposition didn't buy into it. So that's a real lesson for us, is how do we lock it in like that original framework was under successive governments? We just see such policy change and flip-flopping in New Zealand that a lot of good work just gets wasted. And unfortunately, the positive start of the wellbeing budgets was just wasted.
Yeah, thank you. That's so informative. I've been wondering about that for years. You really helped frame it.
Oh, can I make one other point as well?
Yeah, of course, please.
One of the lessons that I've learned that we're trying to apply with our work on future generations, long-term policy making, is learning from what the Welsh government did in the UK with their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015 that established the world's first Future Generations Commissioner, locked 7 wellbeing goals into the role of government with statutory legal power, is instead of it being dreamed up by politicians or think tanks, it came about through deep citizen engagement. They had a Wales We Want process that ran over 2 years. 6,000 people were involved. I imagine if we done something similar with our wellbeing budgets, was actually developed by the public, had public understanding and input, it would have been so much harder to scrap it. So that's why we're looking at citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, more participatory approaches, not only as a way to get better decisions, but hopefully more robust decisions that survive successive governments.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yes, we have a community assemblies presentation next week from someone that's
cool.
doing work here in the US. Carrie, and then don't worry, Christine, I haven't forgotten about you. Carrie, if you're ready, come on off mute. Yeah.
Sure. And sorry, I can't be on camera. Thank you so much, Gareth and David. Sorry to be so brass tacks, but I'm just curious, how have you found the right funding support for your work with WEAll in New Zealand?
Yeah, good question. And I'm totally new to this world. I've only done this role for 3 years, so I've been learning while doing. Our major funder is a anti-poverty alleviation fund called the Peter McKenzie Project. And at the same time, I was questioning, why am I working downstream on the ambulance? They were similarly asking themselves, how on earth are they going to solve child poverty if they don't look at the economic system, which is causing the poverty? So they're our major funder, a philanthropic fund. Unfortunately for us, they're a drawdown fund. They want to spend all of their money to make as much impact, and they'll be winding up in a couple of years. So we don't have funding security long term. We've received some funding from Partners for New Economy in Europe, some funding from Australia. We've found donations have been helpful, but not really significant in terms of a team of 5 people working 3 FTE equivalent. This is, I'm sure, exactly the same in the US. Our major philanthropic funders come from incredibly wealthy families who are benefiting from the current system, who maybe don't have so much of an interest in fundamental systemic overhaul versus maybe trying to patch things up and put band-aids on problems to lessen some of the impacts. We haven't cracked that problem. We've been fortunate to have an incredible funder, but unfortunately, they're going to disappear soon.
That's rough.
It's good to know that we're not alone.
Yeah. Christine, finally,
Yes.
finally.
No problem. Thank you. I'm curious about civic engagement and how people across New Zealand have come to this. When I say that, I know that there are lots of different enclaves, types of peoples, age, indigenous folks, ethnicities, cultural beliefs, the whole bit. And I'm curious because in the US, there is a lot of focus on movement building and power building, but sometimes folks are moving and building power in ways that aren't necessarily synergistic. And so I'm curious how you work to engage the public. How does the nation feel about this? And I know that's a lot to ask because you can't really speak for the full nation, but I'm curious how you got the uh, connected all of those dots. It's a lot to get everybody behind well-being and feeling like they've got skin in the game and you care about my issue.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And maybe to link with Carrie's question as well, we've got a close relationship with WEAll Australia, who formed 2 years ago. Excuse me. They don't have a regular funder to employ staff like we are fortunate to have in New Zealand. So in terms of our work, trying to build a movement, trying to connect with others, we've just been so fortunate to be able to first employ myself, then 2 people, now 5 people to do the work. And it's really hard to do this if it's entirely voluntary. So paying staff and funding operational costs is so critical. In terms of New Zealand, having spent some time in California and done some research trips there, the scale is just so different. We're a country of only 5 million people in a country the size of the whole United Kingdom. So very small population that's very spread out. What that means is we're very relational, which is a wonderful blessing in New Zealand, that you can run into a minister on the street. You can, just call someone up on the phone and get something happening. It's very easy to start something. So here we're very relational in terms of our movement building. The downside of that is we're very small, and our philanthropic funders are very light. We don't have large civic organizations. We've got, for example, Greenpeace or conservation groups. Our union sector was decimated with the neoliberal reforms and is much weaker than they used to be. So a lot of it has to be relational because we just don't have the resources or the institutions to really build it. In terms of embracing well-being approaches, I think New Zealand likes to think of itself as innovative and open to new ideas, and I think we are. But our ability to really embrace it is limited. History is my passion and what I studied at university. And the history of New Zealand is we go through periods of radical reform where we move very fast, and then we have decades of stasis and are very conservative. So we had one of the most state-involved economies outside of the Soviet bloc in the 1970s, and we went to the most open, liberalized economies in the world in the 1980s in an incredibly short period of time. So this massive change, and then we stayed the same for a long period. So that's kind of the flow. But we've got, amazing academics, amazing researchers who are able to make the case. I hope that explains the question. I'm not sure if I have, but in terms of movement building, we have to work together because we're so small. We have so few professional bodies doing these work, so few think tanks compared to the US, that we have to just work together. We call it building the plane while flying it.
Thank you. I'm still curious about your process because the notion of getting 5 million people together on anything, that in and of itself, in my estimation, is extraordinary. So, and it sounds like you have a relatively slim team. This is not a huge group of folks who are doing a lot of the major work. Congratulations, and thank you very
Oh,
much.
thank you. Maybe two things is that um, I remember once leading a campaign for Greenpeace that we got 8% of the country to do something over 6 months, which was actually larger than Obama's campaign on a per capita basis. And it's because we're so small. We've got a limited media market. If you got on the news, everyone could know about it in 2009. That's a challenge today with the decline of our
Mhm,
mainstream media,
mhm.
the growth of sort of polarized social media networks. We just don't have those abilities to connect face to face or even in similar places online. That's a real damage to making progressive change. The second point I'd say is electoral reform was crucial as part of New Zealand's journey on the road when we changed our electoral system, the way we vote for our governments in the 1990s. Because our economic revolution happened so hard and fast, and it really damaged communities, and there's still social scarring, the public demanded a new way to form governments. So we broke that two-party duopoly on our politics. What that means is Parliament is much more representative of the country. Someone like me, as someone in my 20s, could get elected to our national parliament, which wouldn't have happened under the old model. But also, we had to have coalition government. So it slowed down lawmaking and made it much more representative. That was crucial in things like the wellbeing budgets or some of the innovations we've worked on.
And he still got elected even after showing that clown photo. Uh, so thanks, Gareth. Elizabeth.
And mute. Thank you so much. This is so terrific and inspirational. I was wondering for the transformative potential of Maori economies publication, one of the pillars then is business becoming involved, right? And you shared a great example of the governance changes that were, one of the business owners was suggesting or has implemented. I'm wondering, for the evaluation piece of it, expanding the framework beyond the just financial balance sheet, bottom line decision making. Are there any other social accounting models or other frameworks that are being used?
That's a great question, Elizabeth. I think there's nascent measures coming up, mostly in our individual regions. So my hometown of Gisborne, the local community trust with the iwi has local wellbeing measures and a great local wellbeing survey. I think part of the story in New Zealand, if I can just maybe walk through the history, because I think that'll help understand where we're at, is that Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed between the British and Māori in 1840, was absolutely breached in practice for more than 100 years. In the 70s, we started trying to, almost like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and redress the injustices that were caused. We established a Treaty of Waitangi Commission that actively gave land and assets back to Māori, who in many cases were taken at the point of a musket in the 1860s and 70s. In reality, only 1 to 2% of the value of the land or the assets has ever been returned. And we spend more on our correctional facilities, which incarcerate Māori, than we do on all of the settlements that have happened in past. But Māori have been great stewards of it. And now they've turned that settlement into a huge financial asset. So part of the story we were trying to tell in the Amplifying Māori Economies report was that Māori are doing great in the current capitalist economy. That's despite all the barriers they face, the historical injustices. Imagine what they could do if they could organize their businesses in the ways they wanted to. We force Māori to form corporate entities. We force them to do traditional capitalist economies practices. And we had case studies there where people are trying to do things differently. And that's where the transformative potential is. Imagine if they could do what they wanted to do, have their own self-determination. And actually what we would see, I believe, for the rest of the country is people who are much more invested in communities, who aren't just going to sell offshore, who aren't going to pollute waterways because that's where they live, that's what they drink. So that's the transformative potential.
Wow, amazing. So Paula, I can't tell if your cat raised your hand for you or if you raised your hand. Uh,
No, Ruby didn't raise his. He just has a hard time not being
I'm going to let
involved.
you ask our last question then.
Okay. Well, it's actually a two-piece, and but I'll be quick. One is I'm very involved in the International Health Promoting Universities movement, and there was a meeting that I did not get to several years back, pre-COVID, uh, and anyway, in New Zealand. But so I'm curious about the work that you might do around Okanagan charter campuses and the role that universities are playing. And then the other piece is that if there were one measure, a lot of the work that I do at the University of Southern California is trying to balance out measures to track. And, with well-being being social, economic, and environmental, it's easy to come up with social measures. It's a lot harder to come up with economic or environmental measures. So if you had any insight into a direction you might point in terms of indicators that you're measuring. I asked this to a World Health Organization person, Ilona Kickbush in Ireland, and she told me that they were measuring the amount of ecosystem that was being destroyed by fast fashion as an economic measure. And I was like, oh, but so anyway, thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, well, an interesting segue. We're hosting a circular fashion event this evening with some wonderful sustainable businesses. The average New Zealand citizen throws to landfill 34 kilograms of clothing every year. I just find that baffling and incredible and so wasteful. In terms of public health promotion, we do have some really good work happening in New Zealand, and they're actively looking at the influence of lobbying and money on political decisions as it relates to public health, which I think is really interesting, that they're themselves thinking upstream and wondering why we have such unhealthy food because of the, people benefiting from it and actively working and lobbying for it. In terms of measures to track, maybe two suggestions is in New Zealand, we've got the Planetary Accounting Network, which comes out of Johan Rockström's planetary boundaries work. They're actively now developing a measure to measure not only how less bad you are for the environment, but the positive, regenerative, good things a company is doing. It's kind of like a dietary tracker that you could put on a product showing how good or bad it is. So check out the Planetary Accounting Network. They're now working around the world. And maybe the second connection between social and environmental monitors. I'm quite interested in the Happy Planet Index, which tries to look at the link between income, so using GDP and other proxies, but also social measures, but with the environmental footprint as well. And using the Happy Planet Index, it's not just the Nordic countries that often come out the top when you do different models. It's actually the Costa Ricas and the Vietnams who come out the top of those measures. So have a look at the Happy Planet Index as an interesting one. But the last thing I'd say is I don't think there's a right measure. It's going to be different for different regions, different communities. Joseph Stiglitz did a presentation for our Treasury, and he said, look, it's probably 5, probably 10. That's what your car has. It's going to be pretty similar between countries, but you're always going to have your unique ones. None of them are perfect. Just settle on the ones which are most relevant. For me, I think it's getting that public understanding. And again, with our wellbeing budgets, the public didn't fully understand it. There was no way for business or local communities to connect with it. It was so easy to get rid of it. We need to have these measures that people actually understand. They're buying into them, so then they can actually be useful and continue.
Yeah, that's great. Paula, by the way, Doug Everhart, you might know Doug, has been very actively involved in promoting the Okanagan Charter and so forth. And we're also going to have an event on metrics, have 3 different groups presenting. Elizabeth will be one of the presenters on September 11th to bring people together who are interested in looking at different methodologies and strategies for using metrics. So Gareth, a couple minutes left. Anything that you wanted to talk about that nobody asked you about?
No, not really. Just fantastic questions.
Okay.
And this is how we have to work. We have to work in our regions and our communities, but we've got to share what's working, what's not working, the big ideas across boundaries. So it must be a really tough time in the States with what's happening politically and socially. Um, We've got only a very small degree of it happening here, but we're underfunding science.
Yeah.
We're moving back on race relations. It's moving back on democracy as well.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a worrying time, and that's why it's so important we collectively work on a positive vision, the practical steps to get there, really talk to people in language that they understand. We're actively trying to build common ground. I wouldn't say we've cracked it. We've got such a polarized society. We're asking ourselves, how can we talk to people who aren't subscribed to our newsletters? How can we get people meeting face to face where they're not hostile online? We're exploring things like, should we host a series of dinners where we bring people together from across the political divide to talk about these issues? How can we use polling and focus groups to understand some of these issues? We don't know what the answer is, but I suspect we've got to find these new ways of organizing and building common ground.
Absolutely. And, and then when we have something that's successful, share it across all these different hubs and platforms and groups and so forth. Yeah, what really stuck with me when you were talking about how everything sounded very utopian and fuzzy to people, and how do we make it concrete and something that they can actually move towards. And yes, to me, getting people together and having discussions and building community and having people not feel isolated is super important. So I'm plugging again our event next Wednesday, September 13th, although, yeah, that'd be very late for you, Gareth. But so awesome, all this information and how good you are at just doing it off your head and so comfortable with it. I'm, again, jealous. So, but I'm grateful that you're sharing it with us. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And let's hear it for Gareth. And I will make sure to share all the links in the YouTube video and the email. And if anyone has questions, please let me know. But thank you again, and we'll let you back to your sustainable fashion show.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.